Hi, let me just get set up. Thanks for joining. I just need to make sure that I can see all the things I've got open on my desktop. I'm really glad to have you here. I'm doing a live stream of a review of this book, and while I'm doing it, what's going to be happening on the right, you can see on the side next to me over, hang on, there is a currently white piece of paper, and don't know what's just happened there, sorry. And I'm just going to be showing you on that white space where I'm drawing a picture of this cover, which I drew this morning, and it'll just be something to look at apart from just looking at me all the time. Very happy to have you here. Oh look, there we go. I've already drawn the outline of the book. And there we go, colouring it in. Yes, so I've got some notes about the book that I've been writing up today. Really excited about this because it's a book that means so much to me. I was absolutely obsessed with it when I was working in magazines as a journalist. Now, the drawing on the right is only going to last for 30 minutes, so I hope to be finished off in less time than that. Tom Wolfe, the author of the book, it's really hard to get my head around which way I'm holding this. Tom Wolfe, the author of this book, became a very well-known novelist, and he became successful and became well-known through writing journalism. And this book I'm mostly reviewing, actually, to talk about his introduction. It's an anthology. He's not the only person who wrote the book. There's also E.W. Johnson. And together they put together an anthology of various different bits of journalism, and there are some great specimens. Those are the things that maybe date it, especially because all of the stories are necessarily about things that were exciting in 1975 when the book was first published. Looking at it now, I can't help but notice how undiverse the contributors are, to use jargon of today, which I'm sure will become dated too. Lots of white men and nearly all Americans. But what Tom Wolfe does in the introduction is very argumentative, very shouty, kind of somewhat pleased with himself. He gives a context at the beginning, saying what journalism was like just before the so-called new journalism took off. And at that time, he says, there was the well-known kind of competition between journalists to deliver scoops. There still is that thing. That's quite well known. But what's not so well known, probably still today, is competition between feature writers, the people who write the longer things. And he's quite scathing generally about the whole world. He doesn't make anyone out particularly to be a hero. He says that editors saved their tears for the war correspondents. As for feature writers, the less said, the better. And as he says it at that time, the feature writers were basically pretty lazy people. I guess they had a salary, and they bashed out something and it wasn't very exciting. And then if they were very lucky, they might win, as he puts it, a tiny crown that the rest of the world wasn't even aware of, best feature writer in town. And he says that most feature writers back then dreamed of leaving and writing a novel because that was all that really counted, was to write a novel. I'm willing to wager half the people who went to work for publishing houses did so with the belief that their real destiny was to be novelists. And he makes quite a lot of fun of that idea, these kind of journalists who were a bit desperate to get out of journalism. And then he says, in the early 60s, a curious new notion, just hot enough to inflame the ego, began to intrude into the tiny confines of the feature stratosphere. It was in the nature of a discovery. This discovery, modest at first, humble in fact, deferential you might say, was that it just might be possible to write journalism that would read like a novel. like a novel. You get the picture. And he goes on to say that novelists and the literary establishment were pretty snotty about journalists like him. And the next bit, the next part of his introduction, it's even sort of a chapter 2 of his introduction, describes how Tom Wolfe first picked up a magazine. I think it was Esquire magazine, American Esquire magazine, and he couldn't believe what he was reading. He thought that the writer must have made things up. And he kept reading it and he thought, wow, the unscrupulous geek, he must have made up whole scenes. And what he discovered was that a writer called Gay Talese had actually just done some really great reporting and had really immersed himself in a world and really captured detail. Then Wolfe goes on to talk about another kind of revolutionary writer, Jimmy Breslin. I'm not sure that either of those names mean anything much now, but maybe they should. Breslin made the discovery that it was feasible for a columnist to actually leave the building, go outside and do reporting on his own genuine legwork. And so he would do that, go and do some reporting, leave the building, cover the story as a reporter and write it up in his column. If it was a big enough story, his column would start on page 1. And what Wolfe says is that this meant that Breslin could carry on being a columnist for a very long time, because most columnists, he says, after 8 to 10 weeks, start to dry up. You can see the poor bastards floundering and gasping. They're dying of thirst. They're out of material. They start writing about funny things that happened around the house the other day. So Breslin would go out and do some reporting, and Wolfe says that stirred up a bit of resentment among both journalists and the literati. They couldn't understand what he was doing. It seemed to be very good, but also somehow kind of low rent, which troubled people. So Wolfe is pretty, as you may be gathering, Tom Wolfe is pretty pugnacious and attitudinal and a bit of a piss taker, to be honest, but he is really keen on reporting. The crucial part that reporting plays in all storytelling, whether in novels, films or non-fiction, is something that's not so much ignored as simply not comprehended. The modern notion of art is an essentially religious or magical one, in which the artist is viewed as a holy beast who in some way, big or small, receives flashes from the Godhead, which is known as creativity. Wolfe makes a lot of fun of that. He says he just had to get out and do some writing, and then he tells the story of how he first started going out and kind of moonlighting from his main job and doing reporting for another magazine. And at first he was making relatively short 1,500-word stories, which is the kind of thing that might fit into an ordinary British newspaper today. A longish piece that fills most of a page is 1,500 words. But then he says, after that one, I started climbing to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words. Like Pascal, I was sorry, but I didn't have time to write short. And he found that because he was writing for Sunday supplements, which had been so looked down on at the time, he could do whatever he liked. And that included weird typographical things where he would just stick in hundreds of brackets which leap out off the page, or a series of gaspy, shouty noises on the page that would just leap out. And he says there was nothing subtle about this device, which could be called the hectoring narrator. Anything to keep people's attention. And along with that, he changed the point of view so that it would be he would be showing things with a much stronger attitude. He says a lot of the writers were at that time sort of attempting to be kind of a polite British essayist kind of voice. Tom Wolfe's American, and he wanted to develop a whole different way of doing things, and so he did. The typography looked different, the tone of voice was different. And then part 3, seizing the power. He talks about how this suddenly became a really big thing, and the kind of the menace that other people in other parts of the literary community started to feel this sort of status panic. Literary people had grown used to a very stable and apparently eternal status structure. It was a bit like a class structure on the 18th century model. So novelists had been at the top, he says. I'm going to skip past some of that because I think he sets up novelists as a bit of a kind of butt of his humour. He makes out that novelists are kind of sleepy and complacent and hopeless. And I don't think that doesn't really work for me. I think what he does do is make a really good case for some of these journalists who are doing exciting things. He points out some of the devices that work especially well, including the use of dialogue, and then getting inside the mind of the people you're writing about, the people that these new journalists were writing about. So not just describing them by hanging around and watching them, but also finding out what's going on in their heads. Giving the reader the feeling of being inside the character's mind and experiencing the emotional reality of the scene as he experiences it. That's another example, by the way, of how you can't read this book in the present 2022 without noticing that he uses words like he, where today we would use they or he or she or something, or they, yeah. So it is a bit dated, but it still has lots to recommend it. So then there's a question. How could a journalist writing non-fiction accurately penetrate the thoughts of another person? The answer proved to be marvellously simple. Interview him about it. About his thoughts and emotions like everything else. And so that is what journalists did, including some in this anthology. What else do I want to know? He says that one of the great things that really distinguishes journalism is that people know that it really did actually happen, and that's tremendously exciting, and more exciting than it would be if that hadn't happened. Then he goes on to be a bit more slighting about fiction writers, but I don't really want to go there. And the last bit of his introduction in what he calls where is it? Lost it altogether. That way. Appendix. It's kind of like a rather argumentative Q&A. And he talks about how the beginnings of the new journalism were just like, and that's sort of an almost exact replay of the beginnings of the realistic novel in England in the 1700s. In each case, the new form was dismissed as superficial, ephemeral, mere entertainment, morally irresponsible. Underlying such an attitude is the assumption that it's the duty of serious literature to give moral instruction, he says. And he doesn't think that's what journalism needs to do. He doesn't say it couldn't, but he doesn't say that's what it needs to do. As for the idea that anyone shirked, any of the new journalists were shirking the task of actually evaluating what they wrote about, all the new journalists I mention in this anthology customarily go to great lengths, even overboard in some cases, to analyse and evaluate their material. And he goes on to describe how that is, and I'll get to that shortly. Now, how long have I got? I've got we're about halfway through the process of me drawing this book cover there. So I've got a bit more time to go. It's hard to realise today, he says, just how drenched in realism the novel was at the outset. Defoe presented Robinson Crusoe as the actual memoir of a shipwrecked sailor, and Richardson presents Pamela as the actual correspondence of a young lady in the clutches of a man who wants to make her his mistress instead of his wife. Back then, before the kind of recent past, he says, novelists routinely accepted the unpleasant task of doing reporting, legwork, digging, in order to get it just right. That was simply part of the process of writing novels. Dickens travelled to 3 towns in Yorkshire using a false name and pretending to be looking for a school for the son of a widowed friend in order to get inside the notorious Yorkshire boarding schools to gather material for Nicholas Nickleby. Well, that's one example, and I'm sure he's right, but I'm not sure that everybody did. Jane Austen, for example. He goes on, Woolf then argues that more recent novels have skipped reporting. And he says that's a little bit like an engineer who decides to give up electricity because it's been done. Then he looks at autobiography as a kind of tradition that might have fed into the new journalism. New journalism has often been characterised as subjective journalism. One writer described it as a form in which it's understood that the writer keeps himself in the foreground at all times. In fact, most of the best work in the form has been done in third-person narration, with the writer keeping himself absolutely invisible. Woolf gives some examples. A thing that Woolf despises, and I think that's not too strong a word, is the sort of literary gentleman with a seat in the grandstand, as he calls it. Literary gentleman with a seat in the grandstand, as opposed to someone who's getting down and dirty and doing the reporting. This is an ancient and honourable type of essayist whose work differs from new journalism in the crucial matter of reporting. William Hazlitt, who, as it happens, is another of my favourite writers and a journalist, because he wrote in journals, but beware, because Tom Wolfe's going to have a pop at him. William Hazlitt is often mentioned as someone who was doing your new journalism 150 years ago, and Exhibit A is his famous essay, The Fight, concerning a bare-knuckle prize fight. What one finds in this piece is some vivid writing about the blows that were struck, the grimaces on the writer's fighters' faces, and so on. But that's it. There's nothing that couldn't have been just as easily observed, if perhaps not as well described, by any other gentleman in the grandstand or in the crowd at ringside. I'm sure that Hazlitt, says Woolf, I'm sure that Hazlitt would have been too much of a gentleman or too diffident to do the sort of reporting that would have enabled him to bring the reader not merely inside the ring, but inside the point of view of the fighters themselves, which is to say, inside their lives, by following them through their training, going to their homes, talking to their children, their wives, their friends, as Gay Talese did for Esquire magazine for his story about Floyd Patterson. Woolf thinks that maybe one of the reasons why reporting has tended to be overlooked is because it might be beneath one's dignity. Reporting can be tedious, messy, physically dirty, boring, dangerous even. Worst of all, from the genteel point of view, is the continual posture of humiliation. The reporter starts out by presuming upon someone's privacy, asking questions he has no right to expect an answer to, and no sooner has he lowered himself that far than already he's become a supplicant, with his cup out, waiting for information or for something to happen, hoping to be tolerated long enough to get what he needs, adapting his personality to the situation, being ingratiating, obliging, charming, whatever seems to be called for, enduring taunts, abuse, even the occasional roughing up in the eternal eagerness for the story, behaviour that comes close to being servile or even beggarly. He's probably right. My sense is that journalism can leave you kind of definitely in a very secondary position. I'm not quite sure how humble, though. Anyway, this is about the book, not about me. He looks for more examples of people who may have done something a little bit like this and what he admired in them. One of them is James Boswell, who, in writing his life of Samuel Johnson, one of the things I liked about Boswell, says Woolf, is the way he would actually try to thrust Johnson into situations so that he could report on them, get the dialogue, dote on the manners, such as the time he tricked Johnson into going to dinner at the house of his literary enemy, John Wilkes. I remember when I was on the Financial Times magazine, I remember reading that paragraph and being really, really excited and provoked by it and thinking, what can I do that borrows from that? And I was sent to a part of the country, the UK, where far-right politicians had been elected, white people who were against immigration and quite fiercely against immigration. And I remember having just read this paragraph, and I somehow managed to engineer it that one of these people who I was shadowing, one of these British National Party councillors, I managed to persuade him to go and talk to people at a mosque. And I was just so excited. It just like, yeah, God, I have engineered an encounter between him and the people he doesn't normally talk to, but only about. Anyway, sorry about my little detour there. He goes on to talk about Henry Mayhew, who brilliantly collected stories of the lowest possible people in East End of London in the Victorian times and how he caught their language. Mark Twain, even Anton Chekhov, who set out at the height of his fame to write about a penal colony off Russia's Pacific coast, George Orwell down and out in Paris and London, and some other things. And one of the things that really strikes me about a lot of these is that they were book length so he mentions one. Hersey's Hiroshima piece, very novelistic, takes up a whole issue of the New Yorker in 1946 and has great influence on other New Yorker writers. Well, to fill a whole issue of the New Yorker, you might as well have published a whole book, because it's going to be very long. And it occurs to me while I'm doing this review that I'm somewhat describing a world that, although Tom Wolfe says he did do some of these things at 1,500 words, which is doable in a newspaper today, he was mostly talking about much longer pieces for magazines with a lot more money, and that's just not possible anymore. That I think is what's really the big difference between the world of this book and the world today. He talks about some various technical things. I see I'm getting quite close to having a completed drawing on the right there, and I just noticed today there's one sentence that really leaps out. I'm quite excited in trying to find out more. There is no history of reporting, so far as I know. I doubt that it occurred to anyone, even in the journalism schools, that the subject might have historical phases. What a fascinating sentence. How exciting. He says that when you move from ordinary newspaper reporting to this kind of new journalism, magazine-style reporting, you discover that the basic reporting unit is no longer the datum, the piece of information, but the scene, since most of the sophisticated strategies of prose depend upon scenes. Therefore, your main problem as a reporter is simply managing to stay with whomever you're writing about long enough for the scenes to take place before your very eyes. Reporting never becomes any easier simply because you've done it many times. The initial problem is always to approach total strangers, move in on their lives in some fashion, ask questions you have no natural right to ask or to expect answers to, and ask to see things you weren't meant to see. Having described some writers as being too shy to ask questions, he then gives some credit to one of my personal heroes, George Plimpton. In his extraordinary reporting feats with the sports world, George Plimpton adopted the strategy of hanging back in the shadows with such diffidence and humility that they would finally ask him to, for Christ's sake, come on out and play. And in the last words to his introduction, the last bit, Wolfe says, if you do get out there and you do start building a relationship with someone, you will have a proper relationship, whether it's hostility or more often friendship of some sort. For many reporters, this presents a more formidable problem than penetrating the particular scene in the first place. They become stricken with a sense of guilt, responsibility, obligation. I hold this man's reputation, his future in my hands. That becomes the frame of mind. People who become overly sensitive on this score should never take up the new style of journalism. They inevitably turn out second-rate work. I read that and I flinch a little bit because I definitely have that frame of mind sometimes, but I think I have overcome it sometimes. A writer needs at least enough ego to believe that what he is doing as a writer is as important as what anyone he's writing about is doing. That's a great sentence, really great and important sentence. Assuming that this side of it isn't too overwhelming, saturation reporting, as I think of it, can be one of the most exhilarating trips, as they say, in the world. Often you feel as if you've put your whole central nervous system on red alert and turned it into a receiving set with your head panning the molten tableau like a radar dish. And he finishes in his own very characteristic style by going off on one with a sort of stream of consciousness dialogue, as if one of the people that he's reporting about is coming after him. So there's quite a long paragraph. I won't read the whole thing, but the very last words, as this person he's reporting on is coming at him with something violent about to happen, Wolfe says, "Friends, citizens, magazine readers, what a scene this is going to make. So help me, this is the way people live now. This is the..." And that's how he ends his introduction. I now have 2.5 minutes to give you a very quick overview of some of the things that he talks about. He talks about how frequently the narrator kept themselves out of the story, because you can become a pointless, obtrusive element. And so that's one of the key things he says in all of his introductions to each of these. There's an introductory paragraph. He gives some exciting stories about, like, for example, Michael Herr was an obscure young movie reviewer when he wangled a vague assignment from Esquire in 1967 to go to Vietnam to do a column on the Americanization of Saigon. The approach presumably was going to be somewhat light and cynical, but as it turned out, Herr was there for many days. Herr told me, "At first I didn't feel like I was covering anything, I just felt very lost. It was a very dangerous assignment and a great piece of writing." So I imagine that you can imagine that if a book like this fell into the hands of someone like me when I was 30, just starting on a magazine, and so excited by the opportunity to write long magazine features, it inspired me in so many ways. I find Tom Wolfe pretty irritating, very mannered, and very pleased with himself. And yet, despite that, he and this book are incredibly inspiring. And sure, it's dated in the content, and it's dated in the lack of diversity of the people who contributed to it. But on the other hand, it's a book that, what book wouldn't be? All journalism is dated. That's one of the fundamental problems of journalism, is it can't really be something for all time. What on earth have I done? Oh yeah, that's okay. That drawing has been finished. So I need to wrap up at this point. I think I've told you everything I need to say, and by doing it in this way, what I have done is attempt to demonstrate something about writing for myself and for anyone else who happens to watch. I read the book, I made notes in the book, I made notes on index card, oops, there we go, and reminding myself about what it is that I think about this thing. I drew the book this morning in order to give you something more interesting to look at, I hope, than just me chuntering on. And I thought that would give me a really clear container. Like, this is how long I should carry on talking, and no longer. And I shared it on various social platforms. The picture, I mean, as a way of announcing that this thing was happening now. And just one more little thing I want to show is, because it's important to mention this. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because I'm I need to move over here. It's because in January I'm going to be running a session for, how do I change this? Okay, in January I'm running a thing for people who want to write emails for a period of a month. So it doesn't have to be once a day, it could be once a week, it could be anything, but like to have a moment where you're actually have a month in which you're putting out a newsletter. I did this a year and a half ago with some people, all of us together working on putting out a newsletter for a month. So I wanted to mention that. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing these live streams about journalism. And as well as that, I want to mention, just before this live stream finishes, that I am doing more live streams. I'm going to try to overcome my flakiness in the past, not sticking to the schedule. So I'm announcing in this and other live streams that this is my schedule. Mondays at 4:30 will be about making books and self-publishing. Wednesdays, like today, will be about reviewing books, which I'm going to do in a moment on Amazon. I'm going to type up what I've just talked to you about. And Fridays is going to be a new series on how to think like a journalist. So I've got 25 journalists in mind, and I'm going to say something about each of those as a way to encourage anyone who does any kind of writing, you perhaps, to adopt some of their techniques and some of their ideas, and to think about some of the ways in which we can all be a bit like those journalists. So, on my website, there is this thing. If you want to sign up for just to hear more about how I'm going to do this thing about the newsletter challenge, and this is, I'll just read this anyway, why not? Recently, teaching a residential course for writers, I was reminded yet again that some people don't want to publish a proper book, not immediately anyway. For these people, the hardest thing is getting words down at all and being happy enough to send them out. That's what journalists do. One way to do that is to send a series of emails to a limited audience of people who have consented to receive them. You only need one person. I've given many people that advice, and it tends to go down very well. But too often, nothing happens because it takes a huge amount of courage to do it on your own. Maybe you can't see it. Can you see this? Maybe you can see this. I don't know. I hope you can see this. That's why I'm running a group coaching program in January 2023. There will be twice weekly online sessions with advice and encouragement from me, and you'll be part of a group of others doing the same as you. The last time I ran something like this, the pop-up newsletter challenge in 2021, everybody who took part completed it with success. I'm still putting finishing touches on this program. If you'd like to hear more, please join the waiting list here. Now, you might be thinking, where is here? So, I think it's on my talks page. If it's not, I'll put it on my talks page very shortly. Yeah, let's have a quick look at that. Talks. Yeah, it's going to be on there. It's not on there, but it is going to be on there. Okay, that's where it's going to be. So if you go onto my website and look on talks, it's going to be there very shortly. Now, where am I? Done that. Come back over here. Talked about all of those things. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you watched live, that's brilliant. You can leave comments, I think. I'm not sure if you can if you're watching the replay. But anyway, I'm an easy man to find, as they say. Bye.